Serious. Rural folk, what is the most creepy thing you've seen or experienced? Attention. Serious. Tag notice, jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted in any comment, parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns. A bit late to this thread, but I've never had an opportunity to share this story. My wife and I met in a small rural town on Lake Superior, and when we were ready to move in together we purchased a remote cabin about 40 minutes out of town. It was an incredibly idyllic and peaceful existence for 2 years when we decided it was time to move closer to family. We had packed all of our items except for 2 mason jars we had used for celebratory glasses of wine on our last night. When we woke up the next morning, both glasses were destroyed throughout our dining room. It was not like a normal fall with pieces of glass on the floor. There are shards in other rooms, on windowsills 10 feet away from the table, and some pieces of glass were ground into a fine powder. I cannot think of a logical explanation of what happened. Whatever would have created the force to do that damage to the glasses would have woken us up. I am absolutely at a loss of what happened and still think about it frequently all these years later. I can't speak to the cause of the destruction, but glass that is under strain literally explodes and sends shards everywhere when it breaks. It's very possible those 2 jars were under some kind of intense internal strain, and when that strain released, they just absolutely exploded. An extreme example of this is Prince Rupert's drop. This is also why when I go to my local town dump recycling station, I turn away almost 180 degrees and close my eyes when I toss glass into the glass pit. I see people looking at the shit they're tossing into the pit and can't help but shake my head at how stupid it is. You never know when some piece of glass has high internal strain and is ready to send shrapnel at your face from 15 feet away when that strain releases. So people from ex-USSR countries have a belief of some sort of a house goblin/hobgoblin that lives in every house. There is even a cartoon about it. It can either like you or hate you depending on how you treat it. Obviously, a lot of people do not believe in it. Others, like my mom, leave some treats for it: milk, cookies, and even vodka. Now, the reason my mom is a strong believer is because of a couple of stories from the past. She tells that when I was a toddler, late 80s, she put me to bed and came into the living room to see a plate of fruits that was on the table, scattered all across the apartment. Like you would have grapes on the TV, a peach on the sofa, an apple on the floor, etc. It was only her and I in the apartment. Another time she came into the kitchen to find the stove glass in pieces, but it wasn't all over the place. It was shattered into tiny pieces and swept onto a very neat pile. Again, there was none but myself and her in the apartment, and I was 2 years of age. There were other stories since then, but in any case she now tries to befriend the house creature every time we move. I was in northern Wisconsin with my family as a kid. While I was up there I went on a little hike with my brother and dad, just sorta going through some woods. Ended up emerging from them onto someone's property, and the dude there saw us, came up with his kid and asked the obvious, "What you doing on my property?" My dad just apologized and said we were hiking and that he shouldn't have been so careless. We went back quickly, and while the encounter was odd it didn't feel tense or anything. My brother and I also learned a good lesson about respecting private property. However, dude we encountered was apparently not satisfied. I get it to some degree. If I lived outside an urban area I'd be sus too if someone emerges from the forest onto my property. Things got weird though. The guy we encountered actually got some goon who either worked for or was related to him to track us back to our cabin. About 5 minutes after we got back and started to make lunch, this goon literally waltz inside the cabin and begins to talk about how we were caught trespassing. He wasn't yelling or angry or anything, but it was still pretty jarring having some camo-wearing guy that you've never seen before to just barge into your grandparents' house. He didn't have a lot of time to say much because our grandparents owned a few guns, mostly antiques though, and sure enough one got pulled on him. Our grandma held this guy up, and actually apologized again for the prior instance of trespassing. Then she started to yell at him though for following us, trespassing on our property, and straight up coming inside uninvited, and then he left. Was a really weird encounter. Have talked to my dad and brother about it on occasion though, so it wasn't a dream or my imagination. Either way, don't trespass. That's the lesson I learned. Edit. A lot of people are speculating that we stumbled on drugs or something, and TBH I find that unlikely. The guy that talked to my dad gave his name. I certainly don't remember it though, and again had his own son with him. I think it's more likely we pissed off someone who values property and privacy and they overreacted greatly. Regardless, as others have noted, if you find yourself in a similar situation, remain polite, apologize, and info. When I was a child, 2 of my friends and I decided to explore around an abandoned house that was down the road from us. Typical abandoned house look. Paint peeling off everywhere with exposed wood and some spots, plants, vines overgrown, broken windows, roof doors missing here and there. Well, we walked inside and it matched the outside. Cupboards broken, floorboards splintered and cracked. Other than the place being extremely empty, we didn't really get any scary vibes from it. Nothing really stood out to us as paranormal as we'd expect, so we leave the house mildly disappointed. We're walking alongside of one of the windows when this very well-dressed, well-groomed man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a black dress coat, white shirt and black tie comes into view. We didn't see him inside, never heard anything, yet here was this man just staring at us blankly through the window. Friends and I booked it as fast as we ever ran out of there and back home. It probably was just one of the property owners that just happened to be inside the same day we were. There were a few rooms we didn't go in, but good God, that scared the shit out of us lol. A few years later the local fire department burnt the place down in a controlled burn. So if it was paranormal ... well, it's gone now lol. I've done a job for a few years now, noise monitoring, generally of coal mines, in rural areas obviously. My first night on the job when I was 18 years I was out by myself quietly listening to the mine from a dirt road near a farm property. Next minute I hear what sounds like a woman's scream over and over and over. Didn't really know what to do but noted it down as screaming and fucked off. When my boss read my notes he said, "Oh yeah, if there's an owl that sounds like that. A fucking owl indistinguishable from a human scream." Yeah, never occurred to me before that a kookaburra laughing would probably scare the shit out of a foreigner hearing it for the first time, especially if they're out in the bush alone. Should also add that the one of the most unexplained things that I've been told about is from my sister's fiancé. Said that him and his brother got chased by a minute light one night years ago when they were driving down to Brisbane from Blackwater. Said this light kept following them from behind a bit of a distance off. He said he then watched it go off into the bush next to the road and still kept on following them while darting around trees. So he starts yelling at his brother who was driving to get out of there as fast as possible. They were apparently booking it and this light was still keeping up with them while darting around the trees and bush. Then it just starts getting further back and then disappears. I've never seen it personally but he does seem a little shaken up by it, haha. I grew up in a very rural part of northern Canada, nestled into a 50-acre woods with a couple of cleared acres for structures and fields. We had an almost 2 kilometers long dirt road as a driveway that cut right through the middle of the trees. Just enough space for one vehicle to pass through. When I was in my teens I would walk up the driveway and back at night with my dog for company. I say company because even though he was a huge dog, German Shepherd, Rottweiler, he was the world's biggest baby, so I never depended on him for safety. One night I just started my walk, probably about 50 feet into the trees when I notice it's really quiet. The woods aren't loud but there's always some kind of background noise, bugs flying, frogs chirping, birds settling in the trees, animals walking through the underbrush, etc. It was like everything around me was holding its breath. Just as I was trying to decide if I should keep going, I heard crashing in the woods about 10 feet from me. Branches were cracking and the ground was crunching as something big started moving towards me. My dog yelped and ran off down the driveway as fast as his cowardly little legs would carry him. I started to back away but really wanted to see what was in the woods. After watching the trees swaying aside as the crashing moved closer, I got spooked enough to leg it back home. After what felt like the world's longest run while the steady crashing noise continued behind me, I got back home and into the house. My dog valiantly hid under the porch until I opened the door for him. I spent the next half an hour watching the driveway to see if anything followed me. To this day I have no idea what was in the woods. I'd seen wolves, coyotes, deer, moose, elk, bears, etc. walking through the woods, and none of them made as much noise or had that big of a presence. I live in rural Wisconsin, surrounded by corn, marsh, the works. I remember I was in my teens, outside at dusk with my parents, but we were all doing our own thing. Suddenly a woman's voice yells help me from the woods beside our house, just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough for me to second guess what I heard. My mom and dad both turned to look at me like, "You heard that too, right?" Mom starts screaming, "Do you need help? Where are you?" It's moved from dusk to pitch black now and the hair stood up on my neck because it got too quiet. Mom wanted to keep yelling, but Dad just got up from his chair and said, "Inside." I think that's one of the only times I've seen her listen to him. Used to live in rural Philippines in a tiny fishing village in Ambacan. Right next to our house was a fenced-off lot that had been overgrown and a really broken-down house. It always looked really creepy at night and kids in the neighborhood told me it was haunted. From our rooftop you could look into the lot. One night I was looking at it, and I saw a strange blue glow coming from inside and shadows moving across the windows. I couldn't place it at all and didn't hear any noise. No people speaking or any indication of what was causing it. Really scared me. I brought it up to my family and they told me drag queens were squatting there overnight so that they could attend a nearby disco. So, that was relieving. Grew up in a very rural area of Kentucky on a property that was about 75 combined acres of woods and empty fields out a dead end, one-lane road. One night when I was a kid I was sent to take the trash out to the dumpster after dark. The dumpster was already at the bottom of the driveway. About the time I reached the dumpster I heard the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard, like a woman was being brutally murdered right in my ear. I flew back to the house and had a full-on come apart, crying and telling my dad to get a gun. Fox screams will make your blood run cold. I used to live in the desert for a year, and on nights when the moon isn't out or there are clouds blocking out the stars and moon it's almost pitch black. You can't see more than 10 yards ahead of you. One night I was driving down the highway going home and then suddenly in my headlights I see a guy running on the side of the highway full on sprinting. I'm going 70 miles per hour so it's only for a second or two but I'm like, what the hell was he running from? I hope he's okay because I'm not pulling over now, but then maybe a minute later I see another guy in my headlights only he's walking on the side of the highway, and I swear to God it looked like the same guy. Two separate guys in the dark walking, running on the side of the highway. What possible reason could explain that? I didn't see any cars on the side of the road that might have broken down. I was so weirded out. I just had an uncomfortable feeling the entire ride home. My family lives in an old farmhouse, surrounded by a lake, field and forest. No neighbors nearby. No reason for outsiders being near. It's a dead-end road. This happened to my aunt when she was dog-sitting. She wakes up in the middle of the night to some noises. Our dog was less than helpful guard dog and she didn't alert her at all. Aunt sees several people outside with flashlights, walking around the yard. She panics and immediately puts on all the lights and the people escape. She called the cops but it would have taken them an hour to get there. Nothing was taken but sure scared the hell out of my aunt. I used to live in a log cabin in the middle of 300 acres of woods. We only owned an acre. There were only 3 other houses close by. One night around 11 p.m., a neighbor called from work. His motion light was triggered. His wife had seen a man in a denim jacket around their chicken coop, and he asked us to go check on her. Her and the chickens were fine, but after we got home I told my husband that a person would have to go way out of their way to be prowling around out there, so whoever she saw, they were there deliberately. I told him I was calling the cops so there was a record in case it became a problem. 45 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy called and said he couldn't find our house and needed directions. We stayed on the phone with him until he found us. When he got out of his car, he said, "Yeah, I'll get a lot of deer out here." That's the moment I realized how isolated and alone we were. I don't think I could live that way again. Live out in the country, realized one night that we never got the mail that day, so I walked out to the road to get it. No moon that night, so it was pitch black. Just the sound of crickets and 3 frogs. As I'm walking back up the driveway, I hear my husband whistling. From the direction it's coming from, it seems he walked out the back door and was coming around the side of the house towards me. I didn't know why and didn't bother to ask. I just went up on the porch and back in the front door. Just then my husband came out of the bathroom. I still get freaked out a little when I think about it. It was 100% a human whistling a tune, and both humans were in the house. I live in a fairly rural part of NJ surrounded by forest and hills. One night in high school, my friends and I were driving down one of the local back roads to find a place to chill and smoke. As we're driving, a deer jumps out in front of the car, as they normally do. This time though, as we slowed down, the deer turned around back the way it came, walked up to a tree, and then proceeded to bash its head in on the tree in one hit and fall dead. It didn't run into the tree. It walked over and then slammed its head into it. It was the weirdest behavior we've ever seen. Could have been rabies, but was really freaky. Unsettled all of us, and we decided to go back and smoke at my friend's house. Also fox screams. Holy hell, does it sound like murder. My uncle used to live way out in the country on a plot he said was a little less than 8 acres. His closest neighbors weren't terribly far away, within quick driving distance, but also just far enough that walking wasn't very viable. Anyways, I spent my 8th grade summer there, and he had one story that scared the shit out of me back then. He had an array of animals on the farm: 3 hunting dogs, pigeons, dozens of chickens, other various birds, a few goats and a lone horse. And every night he would make his rounds through his farm just to make sure everybody was where they were supposed to be and that everything was locked up. One night as he's walking back to his house, his dogs start going wild. He initially doesn't give care to it and continues on his way, but his dogs are just relentlessly barking. He points his flashlight around and doesn't see anything. He gets to the back door of his house, his dog's still barking, and so he turns around one last time. Way out in his fields he says he does see what looks like a moving shadow. He automatically assumes it's a coyote or some other wild animal and just goes inside. The next night as he goes out to make his rounds, he said he was immediately stopped as he spotted some sort of shadowy figure just a little distance away from his barn. He didn't say anything, but he did take out his gun. Again, his initial thought was maybe a coyote trying to get his chickens. However, as he took a few steps, he said the figure suddenly stood up, almost human-like, and ran into the field, covered in darkness. He said he was so startled he just froze for a moment before yelling out, "Hey!" He didn't give chase to whatever or whoever it was. He did say that for about a week after, his dogs would go ballistic at night, but he never saw the figure again. When he was telling me the story, he said that it probably could have just been a transient, but I don't know. The dude lived in the middle of nowhere and had to drive like 40 minutes to shop. Seems incredibly bizarre for some random homeless to even be in that area. He said it could have also been a black bear, but I don't know either. He wasn't even close to the kind of area I would think black bears inhabit. Dude lived in a rural country farming area, not anywhere remotely close to mountains, forests, etc. Grew up spending a ton of time in the Colorado Rockies. In college, a friend and I were on a weekend backpacking trip up in national forest land, about 300 yards off trail, when we stumbled across a mostly buried bunker someone had made. Think a 20-foot-long tough shed, buried up to its roof. We only noticed it because sun glinted off one of two small windows in the roof, which had been deliberately covered with brush. 3 Later, looking through the windows, we could make out a cot, buckets and tubs of food and supplies, etc. Found the door, concealed/partially buried, which had a heavy padlock securing it. Noped out of there with a quickness. Didn't want to run into whoever had built the place.